Hi, Professor Willingham. Thanks for joining us after your excellent talk at the summit. I really enjoyed that. There was so many interesting ideas there. And one thing that really struck me was the idea of overlearning. I sort of play the piano a little bit, and when I learn a piece and I get to that final bar, I sort of think to myself, "Oh, I've learned it. I've learned the piece." If I come back to it a week later, I've forgotten lots of it because I realized I've learned all the component parts, but I haven't learned the whole thing. And that really struck me as you were talking. I thought about that. Do you think then? Is overlearning, if we want to term it that, is that given enough time in curriculums? Is there a danger sometimes that teachers, maybe not through any fault of their own, they reach a point where they think, right, I've taught that content, they know it, and actually you've been through the content, but you don't know it like they need to know it?
Right. That's a great question, and it's a complicated question in a couple of ways. One way in which it's complicated is sort of generalizing about sort of what teachers are doing in the classroom and the extent to which they're already doing overlearning or not is pretty, we probably don't have the data that we would want to have to say confidently, okay, teachers are doing this. And then the other aspect of this is making a judgment about what we think teachers ought to do, I think is also pretty complicated and fraught. Clearly, not everything should be overlearned. There's some non-trivial drawbacks to overlearning. The big drawback is motivation. I mean, it's not fun to keep practicing something that you feel like you already know and you're ready to move on to something else. So to me, what I think is important is for teachers to know about this phenomenon and, sort of be, and again, I think I said this in my talk, it's the kind of thing where once you sort of make it explicit, everyone's like, oh yeah, of course, that totally makes sense. I mean, all we're saying is, right, if you learn it up to this criterion and you've just reached that criterion, then in the future, forgetting is going to happen and you won't be at that criterion anymore. So it's not like it's, anything that people don't kind of know. It's really just making it a little bit more explicit. So I think once we've done that, I think it's time for people like me to sort of step back and for teachers to sort of think through, okay, costs and benefits to this sort of overlearning. Where do I want to use that tool? Where do I want to encourage my students to use it?
And you made a point about how you can do it. And I think your point there about it can become very demotivating is very true, isn't it? Again, if I return to my piano analogy, once I've learned something, the idea of having to then go into it and relearn a section seems I really struggled to do it. But my piano teacher will say, you need to just work on that section, and I do, and it improves. Is there ways though that, like you said this earlier, like if you can sort of reincorporate it into future learning and sort of bring in that past knowledge, that seems like a better way of doing that if it can be done organically.
Right. I think that's certainly one technique is to fold in the content that you would like to be practiced. So this into a more complicated problem. So the student has the sense I'm working on this problem, and then sort of a little sub part of it is to recall this information that you've committed to memory. So that doesn't feel difficult or like a problem at all or boring because you've got this other larger problem that you're working on. The other thing that teachers could consider is, there is another way to set this up is to think, yes, here's content that I want my students to know 3 months from now. So what I'm going to do is today make sure that they're committing it to memory in such a way that if there's no practice between now and 3 months hence, they will remember it. The other thing to say is forgetting is going to happen. That's okay with me. We're going to revisit this content in a month's time, and that's going to be more of a relearning experience. And it's also a little bit of an opportunity for teachers to talk with students about memory and say like, right, everybody, we mastered this a month ago. What's happened? And sort of talk about the fact that that's happened. And the relearning process is also actually really good for memory. This is something that researchers have known since the 20s or 30s or something, but has really been a very, very active topic, both in research and in application over the last 15 years or so. The idea of retrieval practice, the heart of which is that rummaging around looking for something in memory is actually a better way to cement it into memory than restudy. And so when you think about, are you going to do overlearning, which is sort of practice, 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 even though you feel like you know it, so that it's going to stay in there for 3 months? Or are you going to do some retrieval practice, which may be a little bit more frustrating and feel kind of weird to you because you thought you knew it, but that may end up being more efficient. So again, I come back to the idea, like in my ideal world, teachers would just, have all these tools at their disposal and would think about, given their particular plans for the class, the direction they want to take it, which one is best suited.
Is there a way teachers can do this that is quite sort of fun and ad hoc in the form of, sort of a random test, and not a test like under quiet conditions, but I mean like a sort of ad hoc, right, suddenly stop the lesson, say, right, remember that thing a month ago, we're going to do a 5-minute pop quiz on it and see, and that will be that kind of, and then you can show students that like, that's why you need to go back to things sometimes. It doesn't have to be this heavy, now we're going to spend another lesson again and again. You can break it up into your lesson plan more ad hoc.
You absolutely can. And there's another way of doing that teachers might want to consider, which is to make it even less explicit to students. Okay, now I'm testing you on some content from a month ago. So this is this is a technique called interleaving, which has also been the subject of a lot of writing in the last few years. And the idea of interleaving is, and this is, I think, is easiest to appreciate in math class, because for many of us, we remember sort of blocks of types of problems. And so a new principle happens in science a lot too. A new principle is introduced, and then you get a problem set in which you practice that principle. And so it becomes pretty rote and pretty automatic because you're doing the same type of thing over and over again. But then when there's, say, a unit test in 3 weeks from them, you got a bunch of different problems intermingled. And so it's no longer rote at all, because now you need to recognize which type of problem is this? What's the right, solution strategy for this type of problem? So that's another way you can do what you described. Like you mentioned, like, here's a pop quiz on what we studied a month ago. Another way you could do it that way. Another way to think about it is, here's a pop quiz. It's got stuff from 3 months ago. It's got stuff from a month ago. It's got stuff from last week, and so on. And that would sort of introduce this interleaving strategy where students have to sort of divine what I've got all this knowledge, among everything I know, what is it that's most appropriate here?
There was something else you said in your talk which really struck me as very interesting, which is when you talked about it's important to learn things both A to B and B to A. And it made me think of, if I try and think of the capital city of a certain country, I can do that much more easily sometimes than the other way around. If you say, this is the city, what country is it capital of? Much harder.
Right.
Again, is that a well understood phenomenon? Is that something that, again, it's important to outline? Because if, let's say, if the exam question poses it the other way around, potentially, a student might panic, and actually they do know it. They just need to stop and think, hang on, if I put it the other way around, I can work it out. What more do we know about why does that happen?
Right. If that's well understood, I don't understand it very well. Someone else may be able to tell you more about it. Other than the fact that your experience is absolutely replicable in the lab, and this is when students get so frustrated when they feel like, I can't believe I got that one wrong. I knew that one. I think that's one reason. It's not the only reason, but it's one reason that happens, is they knew A to B, and then the test asks what goes with B, and they can't come up with A.
Do you, putting aside the sort of the why it happens, again, how can teachers overcome that? Is it about obviously just reframing questions and sort of throwing them a little bit by saying, rather than the obvious question A, what's the answer B, you do put B and ask for A?
Yeah, I think, absolutely. So again, explaining to students, this is the way your memory works, and it's kind of quirky and peculiar. I think it does help a lot if you can provide examples. So, in a very common one used in a lot of psychology textbooks is salt and pepper, which I mentioned in my talk. And for those of you watching or listening now, if you missed the talk, if you ask people, what's the first thing you think of when I say the word salt, a very high proportion of people will say pepper, at least in the States and possibly elsewhere. But if you say, what's the first thing you think of when I say pepper? Actually, very few people say salt. And so people say things like hot or chili or something like that. So this is an example of this sort of A to B, B to A distinction,
Mm.
and it's one that even young students can understand pretty readily. And I always like to not only sort of do things that are helping my students' memory, but also try to help them understand why we're doing it this way. What's under the hood, so to speak, in their mind, so that it makes sense. They're much more motivated to do it if they understand why they're doing it.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting arena, isn't it? This idea of teaching students to understand why they know something or how they know it or why they know it in a certain context and not in another context. Is that the kind of conversation that should be had almost in that kind of very sort of, I'll say scientific way of talking about what knowledge is? Or is it better done, or another way to do it is through showing a student by sort of, I don't know, setting them questions and making them realize that, if I take that away from you, you don't know? Or does that risk then becoming demotivating? And, it seems like an interesting topic.
I think I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I got excited. Yeah, no, I think both. I mean, I think demonstrations like that can be very powerful because one of the things that is a general truism of memory is that a lot of the things that are really good for your memory don't feel at the time like they're really doing any good. Overlearning is one example. I didn't get into study techniques that are more effective or less effective, but rereading is the most common technique that students use to study, and it's horribly inefficient. It's not very good for memory. And what it does, though, is it increases the sense of familiarity. And so that I did talk about. And so rereading leads you to feel like, yeah, this all makes sense. I know this. But actually, it's not really sticking with you in memory at all. So I think that because of this phenomenon, that a lot of what is good for memory feels like it's not doing any good, and what feels like it's really helping with memory actually doesn't do any good. I think you have to do a certain amount of these sorts of demonstrations for students, as you suggest, that sort of exposes the efficacy or inefficacy of the techniques. But then I like to add an explanation if it's workable. But then, like, for this ABBA thing, I didn't know what the explanation was. So I can't always do that, but if I can, I'm gonna.
Yeah,
try.
but that's a good point. Is I suppose if you do that and then explain and say, well, actually, this is a facet of memory, and like say that your example, if you have a map, you can remember more states than without. It's not that you're a bad learner or you haven't studied hard enough. It's just that's part of the human brain, and but if you know that, at least you can then think that when you're studying for your test, you need to know that just rereading a chapter isn't the same as then self-testing or something like that.
Yeah, and that's why I think, every teacher has had this experience, which I mentioned, the talk of a student frustrated saying, I know it, I just can't explain it. And especially when you first start out in teaching, I'll speak for myself at least, it strikes you as almost funny. You're like, well, you don't know it, right? Yeah. But, with a little more experience, you can see where they're coming from, and you see what their own experience has been, why they would say something like that.
Well, and talking about self-testing, one thing I really struck me as well from your talk during the World Education Summit was where you said about actually it's a good thing to get students to make their own memory cards, flashcards, test cards, that thing, and not just rely on an online resource, which I remember at school having a huge, great wad of these small little cards, particularly for geography. I found that very helpful, and they were color coordinated, underlined. I wrote them all out, and everyone did it, and everyone would show off how neat their cards were. And I kind of imagine now that, yeah, it's all online. You go on, you find a test about longshore drift or, whatever it is, and you test yourself. Yeah. But your point was actually the act of writing it out and creating it is as important as then using it. Is that right? Is that basically what you would say? It
is, yes. And I would say the writing out probably isn't that important, but deciding what is important enough to end up in your slide deck, thinking about what's a good way to phrase this question, how would I put the answer, what goes with what, organizing it, all of that is time well spent.
And actually, that's the way you describe it there. That sounds like a skill that transfers across both learning and life, doesn't it? Like working out what goes with what, and what is that worth writing down? Is it worth me knowing that, that digit from my bank code or that kind of thing? It sounds like actually that act in of itself carries a lot of weight beyond revision, which is something I've not really thought about it like that before. But what you choose yourself to write down is a kind of memory.
And it, it's probably least, I think it's still valuable, but it's probably least valuable when you're really learning a big load of factoids. So you mentioned geography in a beginning geography course, or which I've never got beyond. But I think actually any really beginning course where you're learning a lot of vocabulary, a lot of it is sort of A, B, what's the meaning of this? Think about preparing for an essay type test in a somewhat more advanced course where, yes, there's still facts to commit to memory, but what you're really going to be tested on are broad themes. And now you really need to start thinking about how this content is organized, how these different ideas relate to one another. There, creating your own materials is going to mean something like, all right, what is Professor Worth going to ask us to write about? Well, what were the big themes? He's obviously going to ask about the big themes in the reading and the things that he lectured on. And so, that's what you want students to be thinking about, rather than looking it up online and finding what somebody else thought about those matters.
Yeah. I mean, I think if I was Professor Worth, I think I'd be asking, how did I end up with this professorship? I think that would be a great question to ask.
It's extremely confusing.
Yeah. But what I did, and maybe a final question, and this is a big one. And so again, appreciate maybe sort of, if there's a direct answer, I don't know, but on this whole topic, to me, and I may be wrong, but it sounds like this is potentially easier. And I use that word, aware that that's not really necessarily the best word, with some subjects like maths or maybe chemistry in its early stages, where there are more kind of clear right and wrong answers. When you come into maybe English or maybe like drama or things where it's subjective, is it harder there? If is trying to remember, why is Macbeth, tortured soul? Why is The Great Gatsby? That's a big open question where you can choose lots of answers. When it's what is the chemical compound for salt, there's one answer and that's right. Isn't that fair to say? Is it harder with some of those more interpretive subjects to sort of have this thing around learning and overlearning?
I would say no. I would say it's not harder. I would say my sense is the same as yours, that the content of the test is going to be less predictable. But in terms of, if what we're talking about is still just a narrow, if decisive part of schooling experience, which is preparing for, sitting an exam where you need to commit a bunch of stuff to memory. Kids do lots of other things. But when it comes to committing things to memory, this is a pretty effective technique. The fact that what's going to end up on the exam and what you might have to write about is might be less predictable in some classes, I think doesn't change what's going to be the most effective way to prepare. You still want, even if it's the questions are high level, you still want to prepare by thinking about, what did Professor Worth say about Macbeth? What were the important themes in that play? What were, how did those tie together? How does that relate to the cultural milieu at the time, and how does that follow Shakespeare's plays follow, and so forth. All of that are things that presumably you've studied, and then things that you can make sure will be in your brain at the time of the test.
I see. So seeing a theme or a topic or a sort of an interpretation of a text is a fact in a way, in of its as much as a chemical compound is. The Great Gatsby is about the American dream. That's what you kind of need to hold on to as your I don't know, that's a bit generic, but I think that kind of makes the point, right?
It's true. And when you think about the nature of those classes, most of the time, what the instructor is doing is they're really building an argument. They do have a way that they offer for you to see the text. And there may be a couple of different ways. And they may even say, like, you, of course, should, bring your part of yourself to the text and so forth. And that's naturally very valuable. But a good starting point is to sort of listen to what the instructor has said and sort of try that on for size, and then see what you might bring to the text based on your own experience and your experience in other courses. So yeah, I think that, they're up there talking for a reason. They think what they're saying is fairly important. So you would be well advised to have absorbed that, I think.
Excellent. Well, I think we've covered so many interesting things there, both in the content and sort of some of even the very sort of specific topics we've touched on of how to think about this. And I think there's a lot there that I think teachers who, the idea of overlearning, of A, B, BA, of, encouraging students to write their own notes or revision guides almost, so they are the ones selecting what they remember. It shows, doesn't it, how you can, some of these things can sound, they're at both the theoretical end of learning, but you can pull them through to that practical, here's what you can do in the classroom. That's always so great to do, because I think it shows, how this all knits together so nicely. So thank you so much for talking to us and sharing your insights. And I think, hopefully everyone listening to this or reading the article get a lot out of it, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.